All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the mechanics of donk betting. My first webinar here at GTO Wizard. I'm going to start off with a couple of slides, and afterwards we'll dive into a couple of examples. For the people that don't know me, I'm the Wecko, played online poker I'm playing, I think, over 10 years now, probably even longer, but I would say over 10 years professionally. For the last 2-3 years, I've been transitioning more into coaching, making content. I'm sure some people who have already seen me, maybe on Twitch Street, YouTube, etc. I got approached by GTO Wizard if I was interested in doing some webinars for them. And in general, I think GTO Wizard is a great product. I use it myself a lot. I think also the guys behind the scenes, they're doing a lot of great stuff. So yeah, I was definitely enthusiastic to do a couple of webinars. I also saw a lot of Saulo's webinars. He left quite a high standard. So we're going to do our best. I'm sure the other coaches will feel the same. Thought there was a lot of goodness in there. So I'm sure some of the people here have seen some of his webinars. He already explained a lot of knowledge, so that's good. So I can just focus a bit more on something specific, like, for example, donk betting. All right, let's get it started. Start with the first slide. You should check towards the razor. If you don't, you're a donk. Okay, this is a very classic quote that people, especially back in the days, would use, right? You would always check towards the razor. And if you would bet out, people would laugh at you, point, say, donkey, he dunks out. And that's where kind of the term donk betting came from. Now, my question to you guys is, why do we indeed usually check towards the razor? Because, like, this is a term that is, people kind of labeled it like this. People say the range is stronger, range is disadvantage, razor generally has a stronger range. All right. And what happens if someone has a stronger range? Betting into an uncapped range is generally not great. Yes. So indeed, poker is a game of equities. If you want to make money, you invest in moments, or you start building pots in moments where you have an equity advantage. In case of deeper stack poker, like cash games that I specialized in, also sometimes you might have an equity disadvantage, but still in the future you have a big nut advantage. So therefore you might still want to invest in the pot. But that's usually a little bit about how poker works, right? We're trying to invest in equities, build some pots, and then make a lot of money. Was another very important point, because we expect him to bet a lot, and then our goal for our good hands is to gain EV by check raising instead of betting yourself. That's a very important point, right? We have some strong hands, but we still check, because we cannot start donking out a couple of hands and then leave our check range very weak. No, we check towards the razor. The razor does the betting, and from there we can start doing a lot of raising. That would also make us way more money than donking, because if we can check, he puts money in with a hand that he's going to fold to a check raise that he would have also folded to a donk. But for example, we would prefer to check. He bets, then we raise, we make more money. So we bet based on equities. Also, for example, a solver doesn't know who is the initial raiser, right? You don't have an initial raiser button in the solver. It doesn't care. It just wants to know what are the ranges, what is the board, who is out of position, who's in position. And from there, based on the equities, we just do betting. Now, why does the initial raiser in position in a single raise pot often c-bet a lot for a small sizing? So I gave an example here. Button opens, big blind calls, flop comes, something dry, rainbow, disconnected, big blind checked. In position c-bets a lot for a small sizing. Now, in position does a lot of c-betting because indeed we would check towards him, because in position has the range advantage. But why does he often bet small? That's like second most important point, because often when we don't bet, it's small. Why do we do that? Value of fold equity is high, says Matthias. So basically, in other words, value of fold equity is high alike, to deny equity alike. Betting, there's a lot of need for protection, which basically means you have a lot of hands that if you bet, and let's say you have 7-6 and he has 8-9, 8-9 has a lot of equity versus your 7-6. Therefore, we do a lot of betting, right? We deny a lot of equity. The more air villain has in his range that has equity versus your hand, the more you usually want to bet to get that air out. In this case, how can we make 8-9 fold? Well, that's by just betting 1/3. And since the board is very disconnected, a lot of 1/3 betting gets the job done, right? This is also the reason why when the board becomes lower, we often want to increase our bet sizing, because versus a 1/3 c-bet, people can still realize a lot of equity. And in general, in poker, the main objective is you realize your equity, while trying to deny your opponent from realizing his equity. Okay, this is a constant battle in strategies. So knowing this, okay, we bet based on equities and we bet a lot for small sizing when our range or our hand benefits a lot from protection. What do we achieve with donking? How does it generate EV? AKA, what are the reasons we donk? We already named one, right? Equity denial. It was very important. We donk because we have an equity advantage, AKA we're going to try to invest into the pot. So we talked about deny equity. Spoiler alert, that was one. And I'm already looking at my next sheet. You guys can see it, but it says to extract value out of our equity or not advantage. This applies to all streets. We are investing in our equity by betting. To prevent him from checking back and realizing equity for free, so that's the deny equity, we allow villain to still c-bet by weakening our own range on boards that we crush. So basically you're saying because we already donked a proportion of our range, then the range that still checks towards the razor is significantly weaker and therefore he can do more betting. Is that what you're trying to say? Weaken our checking range to incentive to bet more aggressive into our stronger hands when we check. Same point from Andrew. Actually, I didn't write that down, that point, but it's a good point as well. But to be fair, I would say that the range that checks is basically, you know, we will bet a lot of hands, not at 100% frequency. So we sort of still have the same hands if we check than if we bet, right? Only obviously the frequency is different. But it is true that, for example, if you allow the big blind to donk, in position will do more c-betting because we have already donk betted a proportion of our range. So this is also more of the reason why we don't always bet certain hands, right? It tries to take into consideration that both lines generate EV. So in the checking range, indeed, we can still find quite a lot of check raising. So the last point that I was looking for is to realize equity, okay? We might sometimes donk certain hands that if we check and villain bets, we'll have to fold to a bet, okay? This is a very important strategic advantage of donking. So we can deny equity, which is mainly on flop and turn. We realize equity, flop and turn, to prevent villain from prot controlling, which applies to all streets, and to extract value out of our equity or not advantage, also applies on all streets. We are investing in our equity by betting. So I'm sure everyone knows about donking. And as I asked all the way in the beginning, we have some donk bet fanatics. Love to see it. Everyone has probably considered it. But what are the main arguments for not doing it? I'm sure there's some guys that are here that are like, you know, I don't really feel like donking. Why wouldn't you donk? Why are you currently not donking? Capping our range complicates our tree. Oh, the tree. The tree I like. Our tree I would have a comment on, but the tree is not necessarily that bad, because if you complicate the tree, you complicate it for both players. Versus aggro players, Javi says. Why versus aggro players? Why wouldn't you donk bet versus aggro players? Population c-bets too much anyway. Okay, this goes hand in hand with what Javi said. Getting blown off our equity. That's an interesting point. Why would we get blown off our equity if we donk? Like he's going to raise less than if we check, and he's going to c-bet himself, for example. So we would get blown off our equity either way. Villain has not advantage, yeah. So we're not going to donk bet on a board where villain has another advantage on. Because if he has an advantage, he's going to do a lot of the betting. And therefore, there's no incentive for us to donk bet anymore. Because if we check, he's just going to bet and then we can check raise. In all spots where you donk, okay, for example, look at GTO Wizard where you see donks. If you would remove the donk, you would see that in position, we'll do a lot of very little betting. And therefore, we want to take over the betting lead by betting ourselves. If villain bets too much, or strong hands want to donk less. That's a very good. And people also indeed say population c-bets too much anyway. I do have an example of a board where I think that's true in certain situations. That's true. So we don't want to donk bet. For example, 4-bet pots is a good example. There is definitely some boards in 4-bet pots where if you called out of position, you want to do quite a lot of donking. However, in 4-bet pots is a very classic spot that is often a bit understudied given the frequency of the spot. People usually just start with a quarter pot at a high frequency. And there's then a lot of spots where you want to just do almost range check raising. Spoiler alert. So then you go from donking to range check raising. Okay. We know not to c-bet too many boards. I like I wanted to go a little bit into the complication of the tree. Like complicating the tree, you have to realize is for both players. So if you think the implementing a donking strategy is complicated, the response versus the donking strategy is also quite complicated because in position has to do still quite some calling. Versus GTO opponent, donking usually does not add much EV to the strategy, so a lot of beginners don't want to complicate the strategy without much EV. Now, this is the one that I was also looking for because it's a very common one. In the solver, okay, especially on the flop, EVs don't really change that much if you give certain options, if you don't give certain options. Now, the main reason why that is because it's a solver. A solver will play optimally versus the donk, will play optimally versus the check. If you, for example, don't allow it to bet very big on the flop, sometimes that will lower your EV. That doesn't really matter because he will have the turn and the river to make up for that mistake by not having a big bet on the flop, for example. We should always try to look at in practice, is this going to work? That's basically the question, right? In a solver, everything, all the EVs will always be closed because it's a solver and it's going to play perfectly. I'm a big fan of trying to get into lines that, for example, you can study the donk bet line. And if the population doesn't really donk bet a lot, the imposition player that has to respond doesn't really have a lot of experience in that line, okay? I think nowadays, especially in poker, people stay a bit too stuck into the common GTO lines, and then you play lines that everyone plays, so everyone is familiar with those lines. However, if you start raising to sizings that people are not used to, for example, if you start raising the small blind, the strategy doesn't really matter. It will not have a very big impact on the EV, to give this argument of the solver, because the way you execute your strategy will always determine the actual EV of your strategy. And this is very important. So just as donk betting, just as doing weird stuff, okay? If you put your opponent in spots that he's not very familiar with and you have studied that spot, there's a very big opportunity for edge. And I think donking, for example, is one of those examples. Okay, I would say on the flop, on the river, actually, there's a lot of spots where I think not donking is a very big mistake. On the flop, I can understand it, but I think especially in practice, it's a missed opportunity. Turn, the mistake becomes bigger. River, the mistake becomes very big. Okay, so let's look at some examples in the solvers. I wrote down a couple of points, what to look for in the solver. This is in general, if you're going to look at strategies, you always want to look at what are our highest frequency donk and check hands. Basically, if you find a hand in a donk bet strategy that never wants to donk, that says something about that hand that we can learn. What are the characteristics of this hand that it never wants to donk? Then we look at a hand that wants to donk most frequently, and we look at the characteristics of those hands. Okay, this is how we want to think about donking. And then we can start to build our range in our head, like, oh, does this hand have similar characteristics to the hand that always donks? Or does it have more characteristics of the hand that rarely donks? Okay, and then in game, if you understand these characteristics, you can estimate if your hand is a donk or not. We don't have to memorize the sim. Same for the boards. Which board / cards do we donk the most, least on, and why? Okay, we don't have to memorize boards, but we have to start understanding, hey, on this board we never donk. Why is that? Well, usually because imposition has more of an equity advantage and it's still going to do a lot of betting if we check. And on boards that we donk very often, those will have characteristics where we usually have a very big equity advantage now and in the future. And then when boards become closer together, we start to donk less. And then we could still, for example, people then say, yeah, okay, on a board that only gets donked 5% or 10%, we can just forget about it. I completely disagree. That's actually a board where it's quite interesting to still see, okay, which hands still have a clear preference for donking. Okay, and that's where we can learn from. This is especially true on turn and river, where you will have like 5% or 10% donking frequencies. And you see a couple of hands that's like, yes, that exact hand makes a lot of sense. And we can learn something from that exact hand. It doesn't mean that we have to find that hand again, but the characteristics of that hand are very important to understand. So you can understand, like, why is that hand specifically wants to still donk? So we can look for a couple of hands that fall in that category. What are hands the solver still finds in low frequency donk spots? Oh, that's what I just explained. I repeated myself. So this applies not only to donking, this applies to when you study sims in GTO Wizard in general. All right. So let's go to the first example. This was a board that I think was already mentioned. A low board where out of position will have a slight equity advantage, but the biggest difference is here. The nut advantage, and can we look maybe at breakdown? In general, we will have more draws in gutters and open-enders that even on runouts on 754, in the future, there will be a lot of runouts where we will have an increased nut equity advantage compared to the imposition. So if you want to know something about betting frequencies based on equity, it's not always just the raw equity. The nut equity is very important in deep stack poker. The deeper you become, the more we bet based on nut equity. The shorter, shallower we are, the more we can just bet on raw equity. So if there are some tournament players listening, this is an important strategical adjustment you have to make when playing deep stack compared to playing in a shallow stack spot. Okay. So looking at a hand that never wants to donk, quote, quote, okay, most probably if we would run the sim out to an even higher accuracy, and I would recommend that if you want to apply some of the things that I just mentioned, you will probably see king, queen basically almost never betting anymore. Why does king, queen and ace, queen want to bet the least? That's my question for you guys. We already know we're going to bet this board because of the equity advantage. If we check towards the imposition will not do much betting. Therefore, we cannot get the check raise in. Therefore, we want to bet ourselves. Why does king, queen and ace, queen not really want to bet? They're blocking the folding range. Folds out's worst hand that are dominated like queen, jack. All right, we got the right answers here. How much do you guys think in position should fold to our donk? Roughly. Who can give me an estimation? So we donk out 33% of the pot. The button opened. We call on the big blind. How much should in position fold? Around 20, 25%. Raising frequencies may be also interesting. Okay. People have watched this spot. I think we fold, I would say roughly 20% as well. So I will join Mr. Joshua for the 20%. And raise, I haven't looked, I would say also 18%. Okay, so the raise was a bit too high. So 13% raise, 18% folds. 80% folds, guys, is quite funky, I have to say. If you have just two raw overs, yeah, it is a little bit optimistic, don't you think? Like, if I see a donk, or if most people see a donk on this board, they're like, okay, yeah, the guy has quite a lot of strong hands, therefore he dunks. Then just floating your ace jack, no backdoors whatsoever, or even your king queen without backdoors is quite unintuitive. What we will also see in general is that the population tends to overfold versus the donk bet. Okay, obviously, if you would look at data, there's also donks involved of actual donks, but I would say versus actual donks, you probably even want to fold less than versus a guy who dunks a bit more of a balanced range. So in general, it's very hard to defend properly versus the donk, right? Yeah, and quite massively as well. Top of my head, they're folding over 30%, like 500 NL plus. So imagine on lower stakes, I imagine that people would just fold their king queen with a heart, because yeah, this is quite good. No, but I'm talking about versus a small donk. So versus a small donk, population folds over 30%. So usually quite incentivized to donk bet. So king queen we talked about. Why would, for example, what is a hand that bets at a very high frequency? Let me see. I want to pick out. Okay, what is the difference between 10-5 and 5 deuce? So 5 deuce wants to bet around 70% of the time, and 9-5, maybe that's even a better example. 9-5 and 10-5. Let's pick spades. So 70%. And only basically nothing, and only 24%. What is the difference between 10-5, 9-5, and 5 deuce? 10-5 blocks folds, folding range again. Exactly. So these are characteristics around why we want to bet certain hands and why we want to check certain hands. And this is going to help you construct your donk betting range, because as you can see, I can imagine you would be here like, okay. This seems quite complicated, right? Because everything wants to do something at a certain frequency. Usually, if a hand gets donked maybe, let's say, less than 25% of the time, you could just mainly check it. And if a hand gets bet over 60, 70% of the time, you should just mainly bet it. Now, obviously, in a solver, this is not a great strategy because, you know, it's a solver. Both players know the strategies of the other player. And if you lack certain hands on certain runouts, and if you always bet certain hands and always check certain hands, that the solver will punish that quite hard. In practice, it doesn't work like that. So what I recommend doing, okay, if you want to start implementing a donk, is to grab a board like this. And actually, I believe, let me go out of this mode for a second. If we go to range builder, and we say button opened, big one call, we call, flop is 7, 5, 4, confirm. What I would recommend doing is starting to build your range basic from here. So we already concluded that, for example, 5 deuces is a great hand to bet. And oh, actually it's already on checks. Why do we then bet, for example, I wanted to say ace 5, but we never. So why would we, for example, then bet ace 5 and not the 9-5 or the 10-5 that we saw earlier? What is the difference? So if we go to the example again, we saw that 10-5, for example, a hand like ace 5, we bet very high frequency, but it also blocks some of the folding range. Or not? What's the difference? Ace high still calls, 9 high folds. But he is a smart guy. He keeps on nailing all the answers. Indeed. So we could say, we could make a rule. If we have the pair with the top kicker, with the ace, if we bet, most ace X, I assume, are calling. So ace 10 is sometimes folding, but a lot of the ace X are folding. But indeed, it's mainly the 9X that's folding and the 10X that's folding. So if we have a pair with a 9 kicker, a 10 kicker, a jack kicker, or even a queen kicker, we could decide to check. And if we have the ace kicker, we could decide to bet. Or if we have cards that are on the lower side, okay? That's kind of how you construct a donk betting range. Allows us to cooler in position as well. Exactly. Any more questions on this board before I move on? So I hope now everyone understands why. Because, for example, if we check, I will show you. It's checking 47%. However, that's after we have already donk betted 41%. So if you remove this, in position will maybe only bet 20, 30%. Say maybe a little bit more. Which means that if we have strong hands, it goes check, check too often, and we allow our villain to pot control. We don't get the check raise in, which is all very bad. Why do we always bet 1/3? By the way, in this sim, you could actually also implement some bigger sizings. I would mainly say that's nice versus EP, big man versus EPMP. But I personally don't really mess around with that too much. I mainly just stick with 1/3. The 1/3 is mainly, right, equity denial is top of the list. Like when I gave the examples, they were in order. You want to deny equity of these hands. Because we also implement a lot of strong hands, in position cannot raise, and therefore we can realize a lot of equity. The two main drivers behind all strategies, equity realization, equity denial. That's why we just start with a 1/3 bet, and then he's still going to raise some of the time, and then we can kind of unleash the true power of our hands. As you can see, we can re-raise around 21%. And I think most candidates are quite intuitive, right? If you have a strong draw and an open-ender, you re-raise a lot. If you have a weaker draw and a gutter, you re-raise way less. Probably also because his raise folding range, especially in practice, is going to contain an 8 quite often, I would say. Yeah, 25% does a good job as well. In general, if you donk bet 20%, 25% of this board, or 30%, 35%, I think your opponent is going to respond to it quite inelastic. So if you think, I mean, if we've concluded that overfolding is going on, smaller is usually better. So yeah, if you want to be a bit nitpicky, 25% is probably going to be better than 30%. Does imposition ever raise as a bluff versus a small donk? Yes, for sure. In practice though, the raising range is going to look a little bit different. What you usually see in practice is, again, there's frequencies, a little bit of everything, which in practice, it's not really going to work like that. What you usually see is that people will raise an overpair a bit too frequently, and their raising range will contain a bit too much equity. So they will choose 8x more often over queen 10, okay? Now, what would then be a correct adjustment if we see a bit more overpairs and a bit more equity? We overfold and we re-raise, exactly. The more equity villain's bluffing range contains, the more we respond by playing back aggressively, okay? Let's say you have a set, you would much rather slow play versus queen jack than versus queen 8, okay? Because in general, if people's ranges are constructed around more equity, you want to do more fast playing. I wanted to go on to the next example, which was this one, which is a bit less intuitive, an ace-3 deuce board. I think these boards, because I also wanted to add a point on boards like this, we don't, if we look at the equities, we actually have an equity disadvantage. This holds, I think this holds especially true. Maybe we should have done it under the gun versus big blind, where under the gun doesn't really have deuces and threes, and we do. Same with fours, same with 3-4 suited, same with 4-5 suited. So this is actually a board that we can start actually building a pot on as well, even though protection is a little bit less important. This is donk a lot versus under the gun. Exactly. I should have probably used under the gun as an example, because there we have a bigger equity advantage. But I wanted to show maybe also this one, because here the button has a range advantage. However, we still have the nut advantage and the future nut advantage in hands like 3-5, 5 deuce. Okay. So this is also a board that we could start implementing donking on. However, if you look at data, ace-high boards, ace-high two-tone boards do get c-bet at a way higher frequency than, for example, the low connected boards. I think most initial raisers in position perceive 7-5-4 two-tone as indeed a dangerous board, whereas an ace-3 deuce as a less dangerous board. Therefore, they're going to usually c-bet a bit more. Therefore, I personally prefer to not donk here, but to actually go for check raises. In all the wheel boards will be possible, yes. In all the wheel board will be possible. In position should lower is betting frequency. Usually what I see is that betting frequency remains high. So therefore, so now you understand the mechanics why we donk. However, and this is why it's always important to focus on the mechanics of a certain strategy, because if we understand why we donk, we also understand when not to donk. Okay, this goes for all strategies. Try to understand the mechanics, then you know when or why to do it, and you also know the adjustment, the exploitative adjustment. Okay, in all theory, you want to understand the drivers behind the strategies, so you can then estimate if this also applies in practice. Okay, how does a solver generate EV, and do we in practice generate EV in a similar way that the solver does? Okay, I will give you guys. I will actually move on to a turn example. I think we talked enough about the flop. Maybe even though there's only 1% straight, it is because there's a lot more draws that donking becomes a thing. So yeah, it's draws, because draws, especially also if they connect in the lower end, we have more of those draws. So it's not necessarily that mainly, for example, now we have such a great advantage. However, in the future, if, for example, on the 7-5-4, let's go quickly back to that because I want to quickly look at some turns as well. If a 3 rolls off a 6 or an 8, it again gives us an advantage. All right. And this is also why in position cannot raise relentlessly. If you have jacks here and you raise, yeah, we are going to fold most of our shitty hands and we're going to continue with our equity hands. And then there's going to be a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, and 8, possibly also on heart, that you're a little bit fucked on if you have jacks. So usually, like I said, equity wise, you want to invest in a pot that you're often going to win, not just because you're ahead now, but that you're often going to win. So include future play in consideration. That's why we don't want to raise a lot of overpairs if we are the in position player. I want to quickly look at some turns and try to apply a similar strategy in terms of how turns play out, because we now kind of know. I would say already, if you construct your flop range in the way that I explained, naturally, the way your hands are going to play out in both check and bet, if you choose the right characteristics of hands, it's going to play quite intuitively. We will usually see quite a high continue frequency on boards that connect, and the lowest betting frequency on boards on turns that connect with him, mainly the ace and the king. So let's look at the strategy on, for example, a deuce. How I personally approach this spot is I will play a mix between 1/3 and 150, because again, there's certain hands that do benefit still from some denial. As we saw, we only had to fold around 20%, and that want to sort of realize its equity for a cheap price. Let's say we have 4-6, for example. I think that's a great example of a hand that I could bet for a small sizing. Again, maybe 4-6, you can actually see it's already starting to bet some very big sizing, so maybe that's an option. 7-8, great hand to just want to bet 1/3. In general, if you want to slow play, don't slow play And with slow play, I mean, or downsize or check. You usually don't want to slow play a straight. Why don't you usually want to slow play a straight? This probably actually applies in all scenarios. I don't have, so far I didn't really have to give all the answers because we have some smart people here in the chat. Basically, they're doing my work for me. Much appreciated. Unblocks the calling range, the pairs. All right, it's mainly Matthias. Maybe GTO Wizard can reach out to Matthias to come give a webinar. That's indeed true. Usually, if you have a straight, you're unblocking whole the board. Therefore, that's the hand that wants to play most aggressive. Whereas, for example, a hand like pocket sevens, we still see a bit more a lower frequency betting because it blocks more of the board. 5-4, I think, or even 4 deuce, maybe 4 deuce is a better example. If I would implement a check, it's probably going to be something like 5-4 or 4 deuce or 5 deuce, because especially button, big blind versus button, they're blocking a lot of the hands that villain can hero call with. Most important thing is hero call, because first the jacks, it doesn't really matter. If we check, it's most likely betting. If we bet, he's most likely calling or raising, right? So we have to then see, okay, if we check, what hands do we lose value from? Well, it's usually a 5 or a 4 because they're going to check behind. Whereas if we would bet again, they can call. So then if you have 5-4, that's the hand that if we check has the least downside, because he will have less 5x and 4x. So if you want to slow play a hand on the turn, quote, quote, slow play, a hand like that does make sense, like 5-4. 5-4 should maybe, also still wants to dodge some rivers, like a 7, a deuce is not great, a 6, and 8. So I think 5-4 is a fine check. Your straights then get accompanied by almost straights. So in general as well, an open-ender usually goes in the same line as your straight. Someone said, pretty insane how every hand in your range can bet, and for any size. Pretty hard to even make a mistake by the looks of it. Exactly. And again, let's say we follow it up with again. So we started with a 1/3 and we follow it up with a 1/3 again. Still, as the PO always has highs, full 20%. I'm gonna tell you guys, that's hard to do. If people throw out a 1/3, 1/3 on a board that was already favoring them, most players are not gonna be like, hey, yes, 7-5-4 deuce, good board for you. But hey, I have ace jack, so let's see what happens. No, that's usually not really the way people play poker. Okay. So, and again, we see the same characteristics, right? If we did donk king queen or ace queen, we check. And for example, a hand like 5-3 needs a lot of protection, has a lot of equity, therefore it should still bet. And then these hands in the middle, yeah, they're in the middle. They can go either way. So they have some characteristics of the ace queen and they have some characteristics of the 5-3. Okay. But at some point, it's very important that you do want to start building a big pot. Now we can still do that by 1/3ing, because at some point these overpairs will all raise. Okay. If you keep on 1/3ing on 3 streets, an overpair at some point will raise. However, now is also a good time to start building a pot. So I think it's very important to have a big bet and a small bet here on the turn. Okay. Any more questions on turn play? I think in general, another reason why we do a lot of blocking, and probably even on 3 streets. I think it was one of Saulo's first webinars where he was talking about the 5 biggest mistakes. And I think there was one that I completely agree on, a lack of depolarization when you're out of position. That's a very important one. That's why we want to do a lot of blocking. And even on the river, let's say the river is a 10, we're still going to do quite a lot of blocking. As you can see, 34%, we can basically bet our range, okay? With a mix, but actually mainly 1/3, because all the hands that will call an overbet, for example, are hands that will probably now also raise. And therefore, then we can come over the top. And usually in this kind of situations, your small bet becomes your big bet by bet 3 betting. And this way, we can also still implement a lot of thin value bets like king 5, queen 5, jack 5, for example. Actually, I also want to maybe show a turn where we're going to bet a little bit more polarized. Protection becomes less a thing on, for example, a king. Yes, you could still, like, obviously you could always make an argument for still betting for protection with 5 deuce. I think that was a hand, right? Or 5-3. That was a full frequency bet in the other example. Yes, you can still bet it. However, you will often get called by a king, and that's not great, right? So I would much rather, for example, maybe move 5-3 to a check raise or something. Is that something that goes on? Yeah, that sometimes happens. That makes a lot of sense. Especially, I would say the hearts one, because it has a lot of equity. No, actually both. So if we would make this a king, maybe that's a better example, then probably 5-3 of clubs. Yeah, a little bit more than spades because we're blocking some king 5, button versus big blind. So on a king, less need for protection because he has binged a lot of the kings. And on a deuce, we still have a lot of need for protection. Therefore, we keep on betting. But we also have another advantage. Therefore, we have a big bet and a small bet. All right. So let's look at turn. I think I picked out a 5. So I have 3 turns, actually, 3 turn examples. But I will start with the most common one. And then with the least uncommon one, also because we're running out of time. Surprise, surprise. I kind of knew this would happen. Board pairing is another one of these very common examples where we do quite a lot of donking. We can use similar characteristics. For example, you see here, if we have pocket 9s, we do very little donking. Whereas if we have pocket 3s, we do quite a lot of donking. And that again has everything to do with equity the folding range has versus your hand, aka how much protection does my hand need. If we have 3s and he folds 9-10, that's a great result. If we have 9s and he folds 9-10, not necessarily that great of a result, right? So again, in practice, I would definitely recommend to bet a bit more pure based on certain characteristics of your hands instead of every time following frequencies. But I think this holds true for all spots. In practice, no one will know, unless you guys now, if you play against me, that someone always has pocket 3s here and never has, what is a hand? King Jack, for example. Okay. A board pair, actually, I remember when donking first became popular, long time ago, 6 years ago, maybe, on turns. It was pair the board turns, you have to donk. Again, people didn't really understand the drivers behind it because, for example, let's say turn is a 6. I can imagine some donks going on here as well. And then again, it's because we have an equity improving turn for our range. And again, not only now, but if the river is a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all cards that we will connect better with than in position. Another very important point here for donking turns. Xavi, let's go straight to the next point because I think turn pairing is already quite common, right? However, actually, if you want to re-exploit the population, people overdo it, in my opinion, on turns pairing. On, for example, the 5, we didn't see such an insane frequency, right? Oh, shit, I messed it up. 5. I mean, it's only 22%. I think people easily reach 60, 70% here. So this is actually something that you can punish. Savi says, after c-bet bigger, increase the donking frequency. So, actually, for that, I will go to my next example. Yeah, exactly, Jay says. So that's actually a notebook that you should run to see what the optimal response will be. This is actually an example. Button opens, big blind calls, 9-5-3. In position overbets, we call. And turn is a 6. But actually, not only on a 6, let me show you guys reports. Even on a 3, even though, it's not like the 3. The 3 is not necessarily that great, right? If you look at, for example, the range, the strategy, and we're in our position, we should actually already fold a couple of 3x. And it's not like we have that many 3x. All right. So mainly the 9, very important. We hit the top pair, but also on, let's say, actually, I put it the 6 as an example. So let's just say with a 6. And this is not necessarily, of course, it's also because it's improving, but in a lot of scenarios, we will also donk bet the turn, even if the turn only improves us a little bit, for the main reason that in position, if in position uses a very big bet sizing, he will still have a lot of air in his big betting range, as we can see here on the flop. He will bet queen jack off. We will fold queen jack off. Okay, we will basically only continue with pairs. Some of these king jack suited, that's basically the only air that we have. Then on the turn, because we have already folded all our air, in position we'll have a lot of air. And sometimes you don't even need an improving card, but just the fact that we already folded all his air, he still has a lot of air, that we want to implement a small donk betting strategy. Okay. Similar characteristics here. A hand like 4 deuce, which is a straight, we should just donk bet. Whereas maybe if we have two pair, let's see, I would say maybe like a 6-3 or something, 6-3, more inclined to slow play, 6-5, even more inclined to slow play than, for example, the straight. So that's definitely, again, a main takeaway. Again, this is a general heuristic you can use in various scenarios. The king queen, I would say again, low. I would say the queen 5 again is a good example. Queen 5 wants to check, whereas 5-4 wants to bet. So again, in range construction, this is a very clear check. Jack 5 and queen 5 for the same reason. It was a check on the flop on the 7-5-4 board. On flush turns, there's a big yes. There's definitely, so let's say, for example, we make this a flush because what's being said is definitely true. So let's say it's Jack 7 deuce. And the turn is, say, a 3. We still see indeed some donking again, because, so this is a bit more common on, let's say the flop is ace Broadway X. There, if the turn is a flush, it's a very common donk spot for out of position because we suddenly have like 60% equity or something. But yeah, so the main concept I wanted to show you guys is after we check called in spots where villain has betted big, we have already folded all his air. He still has a lot of air. And then if the turn is low, we can implement quite a lot of donking. And I have another example. I think it was 3-bet pots. Then that was probably this one. This is a 3-bet pot. Hijack versus cutoff. Check. In position, bets half pot. We call. And turn is a 6. And we basically don't bet range. Okay. And again, it's not like the 6 is necessarily that great for our range, right? However, again, he still has all his air. We have folded most of our air. And the 6 does improve our range with 6-5. Also, pocket 7s now has a lot of equity. Therefore, we can suddenly invest in the pot with a small donk bet. And basically, there's not much he can do about it. He will have to suddenly find some raises with king, queen, ace, jack. I wish people a lot of luck fighting these hands. And also, I think especially when you're out of position to 3-bet pot on these kind of boards, if you just go in check call mode, what you usually will see on the river, a lot of these overpairs at some point will start checking behind. So you need to find a way to fast play. That can either be by check raising, however, therefore in position first needs to bet, or by donking. And then usually donking is the preferred line. Again, also because a lot of your hands benefit from protection, right? Let's say you have pocket 10s. Pocket 10s, to be honest, if you're in this spot, hijack versus cutoff, you check off flop, you check turn, and in position barrels, pocket 10s, you're not happy. It's probably even a fold, actually. Let me see. 3/4. Yeah, pocket 10s is just folding. So, however, if we donk bet ourselves, we can get thin value and we can deny a lot of equity. Okay, versus the betting range, we do very bad. However, if we donk versus the folding range, well, folding range often had 2 overs, so that's great for pocket 10s. And we now get called by, for example, pocket 7s, which is a hand that would have otherwise checked behind, unless there's some weird merging going on. Okay, pocket 8s is doing that, but pocket 7s usually checks behind. So here, in 3-bet pot especially, it's a good example of trying to prevent your opponent from pot controlling, which was another reason that we decide to donk. And to continue on that note, I want to go to the river before we run out of time, because I wanted to ask one more important question. I kept going on with the 9-5-3 here. Overbet, turn is a queen. Obviously, we don't donk because we expect in position to do a shit ton of betting. It's a very good board for him. The turn improved him quite a lot. He's going to bet a mix between 3/4 and overbet. Let's say he bets 3/4. A big proportion of our calling range is going to be a 9. And he's often going to check behind with a 9. Ace 9, sometimes betting, but that's about it. So when the river is, in this case, a 9, as you can see, we do want to do quite a lot of betting, okay? For example, a hand like 6-7, you might be on a turn like, yeah, okay, I have a shitty open-ender, but then big blind calls. Shitty open-ender, but we do see it sometimes calls. Well, that's also because it sometimes has the option to donk bet the river. So in this case, on a 9, 6-7 is just pure bluffing. Okay. Another card that we could donk on is a 5. It's probably going to be a bit less common as we probably fold more 5x than 9x on the turn. not even. Maybe it has something to do with the suits. Queen 5. Queen 5 exactly wants to donk. That's interesting because that's not really the first hand that I would have. Let me see. If we have a queen, he doesn't have a queen. Okay, now actually it does make sense. 4 deuce. Yeah, 4 deuce doesn't really win much, right? So that's the first hand. Remember, this is a spot where basically nothing donks. But 4 deuce, it's exactly 4 deuce. 4 deuce wants to throw out a little bet. And that makes a lot of sense because he has 6-7. He has jack 10. So if you ever get into this spot with 4 deuce, if you bet, how big does he bet? 10% of the pot. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, this is just, you have air, the 5, or at least perceived. For example, if someone would now lead to me on the river, I would be like, yeah, it makes sense. You have a 5. Go big blind. Go to reports. No, it doesn't work. Reports. I was pretty sure actually on a 5 we would donk in the example that I used. So it is the suit. That was it. Then you get the ace high heroes, but that's fine. If you have 4 deuce, you're not trying to bluff ace high for 10%. That's not the goal. 4 deuce is trying to bluff 6-7. That's why it's betting 10%. If it wanted to bet ace high, it would have bet a little bit bigger, if you get what I mean. Okay? Because 6-7 cannot call versus 10%. Right? Jack 10, thank you. Jack 8. Why in that suit and not the others? Probably has something to do with the fact that we mainly have suited 5x. And this one in somehow connects better. And again, like for example, if I would be in position and someone donks on the 5, that's the heart and not the spade. So on the spade, apparently you shouldn't donk because of the suits. Probably has something to do with how much pair we make with that suit. I would still give it credit. So actually, I would like to donk bet more on the 5 of spades because it's a card that I'm not allowed to donk on. In position, it has to know that and therefore adjust accordingly, which is probably then to not do much to any folding. Whereas on this card, I'm actually allowed to donk because this is also an important thing, right? If you donk, let's say you make an exploitative donk, you donk bet or too much, or you donk bet on a card that is actually not supposed to be donked. Then in position needs to know that. Then in position also needs to know the correct counter strategy, which is usually to do very little folding, which is very hard as we concluded, right? Now on the turn, to go back actually to the same, I think it was the same actually. I personally, in one of my YouTube videos, actually, I gave this exact example as well. This is a clear turn where it's easy to over barrel if you're population. With a lot of the hands like 10-8, for example, mainly checking. Jack 8. Where's Jack 8? Jack 8 mainly checking. So on the turn exploitatively, I would not be folding a 5. It's not a great idea. So this is another good example of, especially I think, board pairing rivers in this kind of scenarios, the 5 and the 9. Maybe even, no, I don't think actually a straight card makes a lot of sense. Because again, if the river is a 9 to bring the point home, if we check, again, if we would remove the donk, then we carry our 9x to the river when we check. Then in position is no longer incentivized to bet his queen x, for example, to bet anything, to be honest. So then the main reason why we donk on rivers is not equity denial, not equity realization, but it's to prevent Philip from pot controlling. Okay, because if you have a 9 and we check and in position checks behind kings, that's not great. So let me go back now to my last slide, which is a little interactive slide. Knowing what we know now, so the reasons why we donk, which were deny equity on flop turn, realize our equity, flop turn, to prevent Philip from pot. Oh, actually, by the way, we didn't really talk about this one, to realize equity, but let's say indeed the flop was 7-5-4, right? And let's say we have a hand like 7-5-4. Let's say we have 10-9. I think 10-9 is a good example on 7-5-4. If we check any bets, we have to fold. Where if we bet ourselves, I really like 10-9 because on an 8 and a 6, your perceived range connects very well, right? We make a lot of straights, and then you have an equity bluff. So I would say any 9x hand is a very good bet on the flop, right? Not the 9-5 as we remembered, but for example, hand like 9-10, which is a bad hand that otherwise should check and fold to the bet. Now people say, yeah, we can also check raise, but the problem is if you check and in position only bets a low frequency, okay, then his betting range is a bit strong. And then you're suddenly putting in a check raise against a stronger betting range. Whereas if we donk bet and try to bluff the air proportion of William's range. Okay, he still has a lot of shitty hands, and that's the hands that we're trying to fold out. Okay, it's the same with the four deuce. We are donking 10% on the river, not to fold out good hands. We're just folding out air, folding out shit. Okay, so to deny equity, realize equity, to prevent villain from pot controlling. This is true on all streets, especially as we saw on the river, and 3-bet pots out of position. That example that I gave on a 6 there, it's very important. To extract value out of our equity or not advantage all streets, we are investing in our equity by betting. So taking these points into consideration, who can give me an example of a spot that we haven't discussed where donking would be a great idea given the mechanics of donking? Yeah, do we also donk bet very big on some rivers? Yes. For example, we saw that on that 5. If I go back to this example. Actually, I would say on a 9, check, bet, call. No, wait. On the 5, it was. I mean, here actually we're already betting 3/4, huh? So it's not a small bet. You usually want to, again, we want to bet small in spots where we still want to bet a bit of a merge range, which on the river is less common. Now, there are scenarios, maybe a bonus one if someone can point it out. Let me see. Mono boards, big blind 3-bet versus small blind. That's actually true. One of the, I like this guy. One of the small spots where we can lead, small versus big blind, this out position color 3-pot is indeed mono boards. If you can tell me why, because I personally don't really know, to be honest. I mean, yeah, don't really know. Obviously, it's because of the reasons we just explained. But so, and then for example, on the 5, where was it? The 5 of hearts? I saw some all-ins, 1.9% all-in. Whereas, for example, in the, let's say we remove ace-9 from the betting range, from in position, then probably we can donk bet bit. Actually, we can do that because ace-9, I would say if you remove ace-9 from this barreling range on the turn and then make the river a 9, we do have big bets. But now, you know, we still have to be a little bit careful because, first of all, he sometimes has ace-9, right? And jamming into a range that has ace-9 is not a great idea. Check. I want to see the ranges. Yeah, you see button still has the 90 to 100% equity advantage, but which probably shifts on a 5, and therefore we have some big bets. Yeah, so on the 5, it shifts to us, and therefore we do have big bets on a 5, and therefore we have more the 60%, which is a sizing that these 80 to 90% equity hands wants to bet, and therefore we have 60% and not bigger. Because also, if you jam and you're in position, let's say you go check, call, jam, and you're in position. Let's say you bet, yeah, I mean, I would just fold, right? I would just fold unless I have a 9 because you're jamming one half time spot on a great river for you. It's very hard to carry enough bluffs to the river. So I would say if you just overbet here, like in this spot, yeah, in position can just overfold, especially in practice. So that's not a great strategy. We 3-bet pre-flop out of position, check off flop, turn ace. I like that one. So let's try to mimic that example. So indeed, if you check call the flop as initial raiser, you have the same small blind versus big blind. You also sometimes lead on an ace turn. It's a similar example. Also, again, small. All right. So let's say we 3-bet. Call. And let's say, what would be an example? The board should probably not be too connected. I would say this and then an ace turn could maybe be a good example. Let's say he bets off pot. We still call it, we have the ace 5, ace 4. That's why I picked exactly 10, 5, 4. Turn ace. We don't bet range, so well thought. I helped you a little bit by trying to give the ideal board, but this is a good example. So we check call the flop, turn is an ace, and we bet range on turn for half pot. And again, that's because if you look at in position was betting quite some hands around the flop. Probably if we bet, he betted 1/3 a bit more often. So he bets a lot of these pairs as well. Now actually we even call probably more ace highs. So the turn is even greater. Yeah, and then we can put quite a lot of pressure. Because his range has so much, like if we look at the top pairs, now, I mean, look at this. Now, this seems like a range to invest some money in, right? This seems like a range that we can put money in. And since out of position also in position also sees that the ace is very good, if we check, how will in position respond? Oh, ace, very good card. I have a 10. Oh, I have pocket sevens. Oh, I have king queen. King queen maybe could bluff as it's blocking the ace king ace queen, but he's like, I will check behind. And we want to prevent villain from pot controlling. Remember, one of the main reasons. So we come out donking. We 3-bet out of position, check all low board, turn ace. We have a lot of ace-x. Yes, there was a very nice river donk today from Barry Sweet versus Stefan. Quite an advanced move. Oh, could you maybe post it in the chat? If guys, if Barry Sweet does something, you know, we have to think about it. Exploitively, a flop or turn spot where villain is too passive and will split their range poorly when checked to. Exploitively, a flop or turn spot where Tombo is putting me on the spot here. A flop or turn spot where a villain is too passive and will split their range poorly when checked to. But if he splits his range poorly when checked to, we get a lot of information. Could you maybe give a little bit more information? Small blind has more suited hands. Big blind 3-bet range contains quite some unsuited trash. Some 10-9 high. Nice. Found the spot today. Was kind of shocked. But it makes, so for Hot, it makes sense now, right? Barry Sweet and Stefan, the two most fun players in poker. Yeah, it's true. But if you, the thing is, there's so much going on that they're definitely playing over the line of, they're so creative that at some point I don't follow it anymore. I would rather have someone who sometimes throws out a more creative play so you can understand it. But now there's just so much stuff going on that at some point it's very hard to learn from. All right, let's close it off with some dunking action of Barry Sweet and Stefan. Oh my God, what a game. What a game, guys. What a game. Any poker fan would love this game. Stefan opens the button. Barry Sweet 3-bets from the big blind. Stefan 4-bets. Okay, so 4-bet pots quite a lot of dunking, as I think I explained earlier. Also, 4-bet pots is one of these scenarios where I said that if you sometimes check all the flop and even the turn is sort of a blank, because we have already overfolded, we can suddenly do quite a lot of donking, especially if the check back range of imposition will realize quite a lot of good equity. Stefan, Barry Sweet calls. Barry Sweet check raises the big blind versus button on 9-5-4. Stefan calls. Barry Sweet checks. Stefan bets. King. Barry Sweet calls. And a front bet of Barry on a 5. So basically saying he has ace-5 suited or something, 5-6 suited. Or in general, you could just have a very strong hand. I'm looking at it in a way that I cannot see yet the whole cards below. Or he has a very strong hand that just thinks that Stefan will pot control on a 5, even though I don't think that's very likely. So maybe this is just, I have air and I hope you have air bluff. That's what I'm going for. Barry Sweet has a 4. Yeah, okay. Obviously, we're playing Barry Sweet and Stefan. I should have obviously included the 4 as well, right? Versus King 6. Yeah, so if we now go over our points, I don't think I mentioned this spot, right? Yeah, sometimes these guys do things that are a bit above my pay grade, I would say. I mean, it is a merge, but I mean, he's betting. Stefan is getting a very great price. He only has to call 5K to win 34. Stefan is not a big fan of folding. Stefan would be capable of hero calling here, maybe with ace queen or something. No spades. I would definitely see that as a scenario, or an ace high in general. But the problem is with this bet, is I don't really think we make better hands fold. And usually if you want to merge, making better hands fold is usually part of the strategy. Nacho probably lose. Yeah, Nacho is he's a poker fanatic playing in this game. But I mean, you have to be a poker fanatic. A lot of their plays seem to resolve around spots that are uncommon, people have not studied, and aren't certain how to approach. So that's good that Jay mentioned this, because if you remember all the way in the beginning of the seminar, I rambled about how playing unconventional strategies put your opponent in parts of the tree that they're not used to, and there's big room for error, especially if you have looked at that tree. For example, donking. Okay. Yeah, when a card is really bad for stabbing in position, it will just check back out of the minute. We should definitely donk. Exactly. So Hot got it. Two real wizard. I just realized I'm DMing instead of everyone. My bad for the DMs. I'm an old man doing this, no problem. Yeah, he only has twice. Listen, if he had a lot of money behind, then I could have found this play. Because like I said, I definitely think Stefan has made thinner calls than ace jack here on the river, for example, or ace queen. And then maybe he would fold. Let's say he has 9-8 of spades or something. Maybe he folds that, but I don't think we should ask Stefan to fold something. But that's somebody saying, oh, actually, yeah, I haven't even mentioned. I mean, Stefan, man, it's standard for Stefan, the value bluff. All right. So to wrap it up, I have no fucking clue what's going on here. So sorry, this is probably not in my reasons to dunk, right? He prevents the A high check back and check calling is 0V against a good range. Stefan could make the mistake of never folding ace high. Good point actually from Steve here. He is, so I do think he's going to make the mistake of never folding ace high. So then the question is, does he have more ace highs than bluffs? Because if we start value bluff, the value bluffing as Double called it, he should call with more ace highs than if we check, assuming we're not folding, then that he has bluffs. Plus, there is some hands now that we're betting for protection on the turn, like maybe a 9, that would check behind the river, and therefore we don't lose our stack. So, okay, but let's not try to understand this spot, because then we probably need another hour. But I do, Steve, I think makes a good point here. So coming back to the webinar, I think we are going to close it off as we've passed the 1 hour mark. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I hope you guys learned something. Do we dunk the flop more versus EP tight range or button wider range? Both. Yeah, the range. So Dan actually makes an important point there at the end. Obviously, if someone opens 4x, okay, and the flop comes 7-5-4, we didn't really defend a lot of hands that connect on that board, right? We're dunking from an advantage. So if someone opens 4x, 7-5-4 is not our board, okay? Same if someone opens 3x from EP and you call on the big blind. But if someone opens min range from EP and you call on the big blind, it's a very good board for you. So always look at how your range connects with the board. All right, guys. Thank you. Muchas gracias. De nada. Take care, guys.